He needed rest, food, and relief from the strain of the last few weeks, but his spirit drove him on relentlessly. Queen's rally of strength ended at the edge of an open, bald ridge that was surrounded by a line of forest on 3 sides, and on the 4th by a low bluff which raised its gray head above the pines. Across this dusty open Queen had crawled, leaving unmistakable signs of his condition. Colin surveyed the circle of trees and the low, rocky eminence, neither of which he liked. He thought it might be wiser to keep to cover and work around to where Queen's trail entered the forest again. But he was tired, gloomy, and his eternal vigilance was failing. Nevertheless, he suppressed the urge for vengeance, and taking to the edge of the forest, he went to considerable pains to circle the open ground. As Colin made his way through the dense forest, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger, he suddenly caught sight of a figure sitting against a tree. He paused, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks on him. In the past, he had mistaken stumps and rocks for people, but this time he could tell it was a man. The man was sitting upright, facing the open with a gun in each hand. Colin knew he had come face to face with Queen, the notorious rustler he had been tracking for weeks. With his heart racing, Colin knew he couldn't crawl any further. He had to face Queen head-on, even if it meant his death. He admired Queen's courage and knew he had to match it. Colin strode forward with his rifle ready, but Queen never moved. His stiff posture and lack of reaction made Colin uneasy. He called out Queen's name, but there was no response. Colin advanced a few more paces, his finger on the trigger ready to fire if Queen made any sudden movements. But Queen remained motionless. It was only when Colin was a few feet away from him that he realized the truth. Queen was dead. He had backed up against the tree, guns at the ready, and died there. Colin felt a wave of relief wash over him. He wouldn't have to kill Queen after all. Gordon and Fredericks, the 2 men Queen had killed, had already taken care of that. Without another thought, Colin turned and walked away, his mission complete. He knew he had done what he had to do, and he could finally rest easy knowing that justice had been served. Colin pressed on, amazed at the condition of Queen. He was nothing but skin and bones, a result of the 4-day chase. As he approached, he noticed the guns were secured to Queen's hands. Colin's mind was suddenly shifted as he realized he had been deceived. He saw that Queen had been propped against a tree and boot tracks in the dirt. "They tricked me," Colin hissed as he dove behind a nearby pine. Unfortunately, he was not quick enough to avoid the rustlers who had been waiting for him. He felt the impact of a bullet before he heard the shot. It had ripped through his left forearm. Peering from behind the tree, Colin saw white smoke emanating from the bluff, the very place he had been watching for danger. More shots were fired, and bullets whizzed past the pine. Suddenly, a man emerged from behind a rock and ran for cover. Colin's quick reflexes allowed him to stop the man in his tracks. The man fell, got up, and stumbled behind a bush. Colin relentlessly fired at the bush, driven by the shock of the deceit and the release of his pent-up emotions. He had emptied the magazine of his Winchester rifle and cursed himself for his recklessness. He reached for his 6-shooter, but it was gone. The rustlers continued to fire, and the bullets pounded into the pine. Colin carefully bent down and reached for one of Queen's guns, yanking it from his grip. The weapon was empty, and so was the other one. Colin peeped out to locate the line of fire and marked a path from his position to the cover of the forest. He ran as fast as he could, finally reaching the shelter. Shrill yells from behind warned him that he had been spotted, and the reason for his escape had been discovered. Looking back, he saw 2 or 3 men scrambling down the bluff. Suddenly, a loud neigh of a frightened horse pealed out. Colin discarded his useless rifle and headed down the ridge slope, keeping to the thickest line of pines and shearing around the clumps of spruce. As he ran, his mind whirled with thoughts of escape and the necessity to find the camp where Gordon and Fredericks were buried. There he could procure another rifle and ammunition. He felt the wet blood dripping down his arm, but he felt no pain. The forest provided too little cover. He dared not run uphill, and his only course was ahead. However, that soon ended in an abrupt declivity too steep to descend. As he halted, panting for breath, he heard the sound of hooves on stone, followed by the thudding beat of running horses on soft ground. The rustlers had spotted the direction he had taken. Colin did not waste time looking back, for as he bounded along the cliff to the right, a rifle cracked and a bullet whizzed over his head. It lent wings to his feet. Like a deer, he sped along, leaping cracks, logs, and rocks. His ears were filled with the rush of wind until his quick eye caught sight of the thick-growing spruce foliage close to the precipice. He sprang down into the green mass, his weight precipitating him through the upper branches. But lower down, his spread arms broke his fall, then retarded it until he caught. He descended from the treetop, using the branches as his ladder. The spruce branch held his weight as he moved down, hand over hand, towards the trunk. He found other branches that led him down to the brown, shady slope. He moved under the trees, confident that he was hidden from view. He rested on a gray-lichened cliff, listening for any sounds of pursuit. He heard a faint crack of hoof on stone from above, but it seemed to be moving away from him. He knew that eventually his pursuers would find him. But for now he was safe. He looked at the wound on his arm. The bullet had gone through, but hadn't broken any bones. His shirt was soaked with blood. He rolled up his sleeve and wrapped his scarf tightly around the wound, but the blood still oozed out. He felt a throbbing pain and knew he had to act quickly. He realized he had escaped danger, but he was in rugged terrain and had no weapons except for his knife. He had very little food left, only some salt and matches. He needed to find his last camp where he could get a rifle and ammunition, bake bread and rest before continuing his pursuit of the rustlers. He believed he was in the canyon where the fight had taken place on the rim and later in the woodland below. He knew he had to move quickly before he was caught by the rustlers. He stood up and made his way down the spruce-covered hill towards the open grassy area he could see through the trees. Moving slowly and cautiously like an experienced Indian, he couldn't help but ponder the events that had led him here. Queen had fled towards the canyon and got lost in the fog before making a heroic attempt to climb the Manzanita slope and reach his comrades. But he had failed, and in Colin's mind it seemed that Queen had waited for him with guns in hand. He had died in that position, but his comrades had found him and taken the shells from his guns. They had propped him up to lure Colin into a trap. It was a cunning plan, probably orchestrated by Jordan, who had become a dangerous foe since the fight at the Vandaway Ranch. Jordan now controlled the remnants of the gang and had taken Ellen Jorth captive. As Colin moved towards the canyon, the wall on his right grew more rugged, and the one on his left showed wooded slopes and breaks. He finally reached an open space with a winding willow border to the west and a long, low, pine-dotted bench to the east. It took him a few moments to realize that he was looking at the rugged bluff above the bench. Up the canyon for several miles lay the spot where Queen had caught Colin and his comrades by surprise at their campfire. Colin was certain that the rustlers were hiding somewhere in the vicinity. He moved with the utmost stealth, making sure not to miss any sound, movement, or unnatural occurrence in the wild peace of the canyon. Suddenly he caught a whiff of something unusual. Sheep. He was astonished to smell sheep. There must be a flock nearby. He glided along beneath the trees and saw that the sheep tracks led to an open area in the willow brake. He heard the faint tinkling of bells, and when he looked up he saw an immense gray, woolly patch that covered acres and acres of grass. There were thousands of sheep grazing there. Colin knew that there were several flocks of Yorth's sheep on the mountain, but he had never imagined they would be so far west, more than 20 miles from Chevelong Canyon. He could not see any herders or dogs, but he knew that there must be dogs close to the flock. He could not hope to evade the scent and sight of shepherd dogs, no matter how cunning he was. It would be best to go back the way he had come, wait for darkness, cross the canyon and climb out, and work around to his objective point. He turned to go back, but was stopped in his tracks by the sound of hooves. Horses were coming from the direction he intended to take. They were close. Colin quickly concluded that the men who had chased him up on the rim had made their way down into the canyon. He realized that he had no safe hiding place nearby. He couldn't risk being seen by whoever was coming. The woodland on either side of the grassy lane was too thin for cover. Colin was forced to turn back up the canyon, hoping to find a hiding place or a break in the wall to climb up. He hugged the base of the wall, slipping past the point where he had seen the sheep and continuing until he was stopped by a bend in the dense line of willows. The willows sheared to the west and ran close to the high wall. Colin kept going until he was stooping under a curling border of willow thicket with slim yellow branches and masses of green foliage brushing against the wall. Suddenly he encountered an abrupt corner of rock. Rounding it, he discovered that it ran at right angles with the one he had just passed. Peering up through the willows, he saw a narrow crack in the main wall of the canyon that had been concealed by low willows and leaning spruces above. It was a wild, hidden retreat. Along the base of the wall there were tracks of small animals. The place was odorous, like all dense thickets, but it was not dry. Water ran through there somewhere. Colin drew easier breath. All sounds except the rustling of birds or mice in the willows had ceased. The break was pervaded by a dreamy emptiness. Colin decided to steal on a little farther, then wait until he felt he might safely dare go back. The golden-green gloom suddenly brightened. Light showed ahead, and parting the willows, he looked out into a narrow, winding canyon with an open, grassy, willow-streaked lane in the center. On each side was a thin strip of woodland. His surprise was short-lived, as a crashing of horses back of him in the willows gave him a shock. He ran out along the base of the wall, back of the trees. He couldn't risk being seen. The narrow side gorge was barely covered in trees and had little underbrush. Young spruces grew with thick branches that reached the grass, providing cover for Colin if he needed it. However, he knew that with sheepdogs around, hiding was not a viable option. The horsemen approaching could be sheep herders or something else entirely. Colin slowed his horse to look back. He couldn't see anything, but he could still hear the horses, although they were farther away now. The narrow gorge opened up ahead of him like the neck of a bottle. He decided to run to the head of it and look for a place to climb to the top. Despite his urgency, Colin couldn't help but notice the wild nature of the side gorge. It was a hidden pine-fringed crack in the rock-ribbed and canyon-cut tableland. The sky above him looked like a winding stream of blue, while the walls were red and bulged out in spruce-greened shelves. The distance between the walls was barely 100 feet, and jumbles of rock obstructed his path. He had to walk at the edge of the timber to make progress. As he went further, the gorge widened, and the terrain became wilder and more rugged. Through the trees ahead, Colin saw where the walls circled to meet the cliff on the left, forming an oval depression. He couldn't tell what it was, but it appeared to be a small opening surrounded by dense thickets and overhanging walls. Colin's anxiety grew to alarm as he realized he might not find a way to scale the rough cliffs. Breathing heavily, he stopped again. The situation was becoming critical, and his physical condition was deteriorating. Exhausted and weakened by lack of sleep, food, and a pursuit that seemed endless, Colin knew he couldn't risk any strenuous effort. He had to be cunning and weigh all his chances. As he stumbled upon a hidden cabin, he approached it with caution, knowing it could be a trap. At first glance, the cabin appeared to be long deserted, but he had no time for another look. The sound of horses approaching made him jerk with instinctive impulse, but he managed to restrain himself. To turn back or run ahead would be fatal, so he had to hide. Glancing around, he saw no covert behind the cabin. The clip-clop of hoofs sounded closer, and Colin knew he had to act fast. He fought the primitive animal sense to escape and instead glided along the front of the cabin. It was then that he saw that the cabin adjoined another. He reached the door, about to peep inside, when the thud of hooves and voices close at hand made him freeze. Through the thin line of trees he saw moving red objects, horses. He had to run. As he passed the door, he caught a musty, woody odor and saw the bare dirt floor. This cabin was unused. He halted, giving a quick look back to make sure he wasn't being followed. He had to rest and regain his strength before continuing his escape. As soon as Colin entered the cabin, his eyes fell upon a ladder that was leaning against the wall. Without a second thought, he climbed up to the loft and laid down on the rough-hewn rafters. It was pitch black up there, but he could still make out the opening. Suddenly he heard the sound of hooves outside the cabin, and his heart began to race. He listened as the person outside dismounted and made their way towards the door. "Well, sweetheart, here we are home again," drawled a slow, cool, mocking Texas voice. "Home! I wonder, Jordan, did you ever have a home, a mother, a sister, much less a sweetheart?" was the bitter and caustic reply. Colin's body went cold with shock as he realized that the woman's voice belonged to Ellen Jorth. He had loved her once, but he knew that she was no good. The sound of her voice had lingered in his dreams, and he had stumbled upon the Yorth faction's rendezvous. He had loved her desperately, knowing from her own lips that she was worthless. He had even spared her father and uncle, weakening or losing the cause of the Vandeways. No ordeal, not even Queen's, could compare with the desperate situation he now found himself in. The final Vandeway had been dealt a cruel fate, caught like a helpless rodent in a trap. He lay wounded and weaponless, forced to listen as Ellen Yorth carried out her mocking threat. His honor, his word, his lineage, all demanded that he be the last to fall in the Yorth-Vandewey feud. But with a knife and one good arm, could he really lay there and watch it happen? Chapter 14. The sound of saddles hitting the ground echoed through the soft turf, followed by the stamp of horses being loosened. Inside the cabin, Colin heard a rustle at the door, followed by a hard knock against wood. He peered through a crack between the rafters and saw a rifle leaning against the sill. The doorstep darkened as Ellen Yorth sat down with a tired sigh, taking off her sombrero. The light shone on her dark brown hair, which hung in a tangled braid, and the warm golden tan of her neck. She wore a torn and soiled gray blouse that clung to her slender shoulders. "What are you going to do, Jordan?" she asked suddenly, her voice carrying a tone that sent a chill through Colin's senses. "We'll stay here," Jordan responded, his spurred boots clinking as he moved. "I won't stay here," Ellen declared. "It makes me sick to think of how Uncle Tad died in there alone, helpless and suffering. The place seems haunted." "I agree that it's tough on you," Jordan said. "But what the hell can we do?" A long silence followed, which Ellen did not break. "Something has happened around here since early morning," Jordan stated. "Summers and Springer haven't come back, and Antonio's gone." "Did you hear those rifle shots, Ellen?" Jordan asked, looking around cautiously. "I reckon I did," she replied, her tone gloomy. "And which way do you think they came from?" "To me it sounded like they came from up on the bluff, pretty far back," Jordan said, deep in thought. "Well, that's what I was thinking, too, and it's got me worried," Jordan said, his mind racing. "You know Summers stumbled upon the last camp of the Vandeweys. He dug up a grave and found the bodies of Jim Gordon and another man he didn't know. Queen made good on his promise and took out the Vandewey gang, killing those men. But either he or Colin Vandewey left behind bloody tracks. If it was Queen's, then Vandewey is probably after him. And if it was Vandewey's, then Queen is probably following him. Summers and Springer couldn't follow the trail. They're not great at tracking. But they've been searching the woods for days, hoping to find Queen. But now they might have run into Vandewey instead. And if they did and got away from him, they'll be here sooner or later. If Vandewey was too much for them, he'll hunt for my trail. I'm betting that either Queen or Colin Vandewey is dead, and I'm hoping it's Vandewey. Because if he isn't dead, he's the last of the Vandeweys, and maybe I'm the last of Yorth's gang. I'm not keen on running into the half-breed. That's why I suggest we stay here. This is a great hiding spot. We have food, water, and grass." "Me stay here with you alone?" Ellen's voice was a mix of shock and disbelief. Colin held his breath, wondering what was going to happen next. He felt a sense of impending doom, but deep down he knew that Ellen's acceptance of Jordan's proposal was not going to be the end of it. There was something else brewing, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The silence was heavy and poignant. He couldn't believe that his heart and mind had believed her betraying words, but his soul had not. Ellen Yorth remained quiet, her head bowed thoughtfully and her shoulders slumped slightly. Jordan tried to break the silence, asking her what had happened to her. She replied dejectedly, "All the misery possible to a woman." Jordan tried to persuade her, saying he wasn't denying the hard facts of her life, but he couldn't figure out the change in her. She responded sharply, saying that whoever was responsible for his makeup left out a mind and feeling. Jordan laughed, but his patience was running thin. He asked her how much longer she was going to be standoffish, and she replied sullenly, telling him to leave her alone. The Texan's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Ellen Yorth picked up her rifle and headed towards the cabin, telling Jordan to fetch her pack and blankets. Colin watched as she placed the rifle carefully in a chink between two logs before turning back to face the wall. He thought he knew her, but he didn't. Her face seemed older and graver, but the beauty remained somehow different. There was a change that he couldn't quite put his finger on. Her lips were bright red and slightly parted, while her eyes seemed to stare straight through Colin with a passionate intensity. He was unable to immediately discern the meaning behind her expression, too lost in the features that had captivated him for so long. But just as quickly he realized that the woman before him was tired and hunted, unwilling to bear any more. Her chest heaved beneath the torn blouse, and her hands clenched tightly at her sides as she waited for the jangling footsteps that signaled Jordan's arrival. As soon as Jordan appeared at the door, Ellen's demeanor changed entirely. She became a woman hiding her emotions, relaxing and fading back into herself. "Throw them here," she instructed, pointing to the blankets and pack that Jordan carried. "I reckon you needn't bother coming in." Jordan was angered by her dismissive tone and refused to leave. He stepped over the threshold and into the cabin, tossing the blankets at her feet and the pack after it. He then sat down in the doorway facing Ellen and reached into his pocket for a bag of tobacco. He stared at her the entire time, taking in her features in the unobstructed light. "Well, Ellen, I reckon we'll have it out right now and here," he said, beginning to roll a cigarette. "I'm going to have things the way they were before and more." Ellen demanded to know what he meant, but Jordan was evasive. "You know what I mean," he replied, his fingers trembling as he finished rolling the cigarette. Colin watched as the tension between the two grew thicker, the emotions in the room more volatile by the second. The man's voice and actions were slowly losing control over himself. "Maybe I don't. You better talk straight," he said. The rustler had clear gray-yellow eyes that were flawless like crystal. Suddenly they danced with fiery flecks. "The last time I touched you, I got hit for it, and that's been bothering me," he said. "Jordan, if you touch me again, you'll get hit again," she said, giving him a dark, straight glance. A frown wrinkled his level brows. "You mean that?" he asked thickly. "I sure do," she replied. He accepted her assertion, and his face lost its incredulity and bewilderment. "I've been waiting for you to love me. Your giving in without that wasn't enough for me," he declared with a gesture that showed dignified emotion. At these words, Colin Vanderway felt an icy, sickening shudder creep into his soul. The end of his dream had been a long time coming, but it had finally arrived. A mocking voice like a hollow wind echoed through his heart, which had harbored faith. She burst into speech louder and sharper than before, and Colin's strangely throbbing ears couldn't distinguish the first words. "You! I never gave in to you, and I never will," she said. "But, girl, I kissed you, hugged you, and handled you," he expostulated, and the making of the cigarette ceased. "Yes, you did, you brute, when I was so downhearted and weak I couldn't lift my hand," she flashed. "Uh-huh. You mean I couldn't do that now?" he asked, straining with words. "I should smile, I do, Jim Jordan," she replied. "Well, maybe I'll see presently," he went on, "but I'm sure curious. Dags, then he was nothing to you?" he asked. "No more than you," she said morbidly. "He used to run after me long ago, it seems. Back then I was just a young girl and hadn't known any men except for rough ones. I couldn't keep them at arm's length every minute of every day. Sometimes, before I knew it, I didn't care. I was naive. A kiss meant nothing to me. But after I knew—" Ellen dropped her head in silence, lost in thought. "Do you really expect me to believe that?" he mocked. "Who cares what you believe?" she snapped back with her head held high. "What about Sim Brace?" "That liar. He spread lies about me, Jim Jordan, and any real man would have known he was lying." "Well, Sim always bragged about you being his girl," Jordan claimed, "and he wasn't too picky about the details of your love-making." Ellen gazed out the door as if the forest outside was a sanctuary. She sensed more about the man than what was in his speech and posture. Her lips tightened, hiding their trembling and keeping her fiery tongue in check. Colin, lost in his thoughts, tried to perceive more. Ellen wasn't scared of Jordan yet, but she was scared of the situation. Colin's heart raced. All his beliefs and convictions were in shambles. Nothing was true. He felt like he was in a nightmare and would wake up any moment. But he knew something important was about to happen. Jordan tended to his cigarette, rolling it and lighting it with his head lowered. When he exhaled a cloud of smoke, he looked up with a face as hard as flint and eyes as fiery as molten steel. "What about Colin Vanderway, our half-breed Nez Perce friend who was seen getting close to you?" he drawled. Ellen Jorth was trembling with anger, and her face turned red with fury. "You damned Texan!" she shouted at Jim Jordan. "I wish Colin Vanderway would come in here or jump down from that loft. He killed Greaves for defaming my name, and he would kill you for insulting me, and I would love to watch him do it. You cold-blooded thief, liar, and rustler. You lied about my father's death and stole his gold, and now you expect me to fall into your arms? Can't you tell a decent woman? Was your mother or sister decent? I'm appealing to deaf ears." "But you'll hear this, Jim Jordan," she continued. "I'm not what you think I am. I'm not the hussy that you and your lies have made me out to be. I'm a Yorth, and I have no home, no family, and no friends. I've been forced to live my life with vile rustlers like you and Dags. But I've been good. I am good, so help me God. You and all your rottenness can't make me bad." Jordan stood up straight, his demeanor changing from relaxed to alert. Colin Vandewey, who had been frozen with dread, suddenly came back to life. He silently drew his knife and waited, watching Jordan like a wildcat. He planned to pounce on him the moment he stepped close enough to the edge of the loft. But he had to be careful. Jordan had a gun on his hip, and he couldn't let him draw it. "Oh, so you want Colin Vandewey to come in here?" Jordan taunted. "Well, if I had any sympathy for you, it's gone now," Jordan sneered, his arms sweeping towards Ellen in a swift motion. She didn't even have time to react before his hand made contact with her, gripping onto her blouse sleeve and flinging her across the cabin room. She gasped for air, using both her arms to try and protect herself as Jordan slowly approached her. Colin, consumed with anger, rose to his feet but realized he couldn't make it to Jordan in time. He sat back down, watching through the crack between the rafters. Ellen, on the other hand, didn't back away or scream. Every muscle in her body was tense, ready to fight back. Her fierce gaze would have intimidated anyone less heartless than Jordan. Without warning, Jordan's hand reached between Ellen's arms and tore her blouse off in one violent motion. The sight of her bare shoulders and chest made her face flush with embarrassment and anger. She sank to her knees, trying to cover herself with folded arms and trembling hands. Jordan, consumed by his own passion, didn't try to hold her or get any closer. But just as he was about to make his next move, the sound of galloping hooves outside made him freeze in his tracks. "Damn it," he cursed. "Who's that?" He threw the remnants of Ellen's blouse in her face and headed towards the door. Colin watched as Ellen tried to cover herself with the torn blouse, her eyes glued to the door where the hoofbeats had stopped. "Jim, there's going to be some serious consequences," gasped out a breathless voice. "Well, Springer, I hope you paid them without messing up my plans," retorted Jordan calmly and sharply. "Plans? Ha, you'll forget about your girlfriend in a minute," replied Springer, "when I catch my breath." "Where's Summers?" demanded Jordan. "I think he got shot up if my eyes didn't deceive me." "Where is he?" yelled Jordan. "Jim, he's hiding in the bushes around that bluff. I didn't wait to see how badly he was hurt, but he definitely took some bullets, and he fell like a chicken with its head chopped off." "Where's Antonio?" "He ran like the Mexican he is," declared Springer disgustedly. "Uh-huh. And where's Queen?" queried Jordan after a significant pause. "Dead." The ensuing silence was filled with a tension that held Colin in a cold embrace. He saw the girl below rise from her knees, one hand holding her blouse to her chest, the other extended, and with a strange, restrained, almost frenzied expression she swayed towards the door. "Well, speak up," ordered Jordan harshly. "Jim, there's not much to say," replied Springer, taking a deep breath. "But what there is definitely interesting. Summers and I took Antonio with us. He left his woman with the sheep, and we rode up the canyon, climbed out on top, and circled back on the ridge. That's how we've been looking for tracks. Up there in a bare spot, we ran straight into Queen sitting against a tree right out in the open. The strangest sight you've ever seen. The damn gunslinger had sat down to wait for Vandewey, who was trailing him as we suspected, and he died there. He wasn't cold when we found him. Summers was quick to spot a trick, so he propped Queen up and tied the guns to his hands. And Jim, the weirdest thing about that deal was that Queen's guns were empty. Not a single bullet left. It left us baffled. We left him there, hidden high on the bluff, maybe 100 yards away. The horses were left behind a thicket, and we waited there for a long time. But eventually the half-breed arrived. He was too smart, too much of an Indian to cross the open ground, so he went around it. And then he saw Queen. It was fascinating to watch him. After a while he pulled out his rifle and went straight for Queen. At this point I wanted to shoot him. I could have killed him, but Summers told me to wait and make sure. When Vandewey got to Queen, he was partly hidden by a tree. I couldn't wait any longer, so I shot. I hit him too. We all started shooting. Summers showed himself, and that's when Vandewey opened fire. He used up a whole magazine on Summers and then suddenly stopped. It didn't take me long to figure out that he was probably out of shells. When I saw him run, I was sure of it. We then went to the horses and rode after Vandewey. Soon I saw him running like a deer down the ridge. I yelled and spurred my horse after him. Antonio quit on me at this point, but I kept going. I managed to take a shot at Vandewey, and he ran out of sight. I followed him by the spots of blood on the stones and grass until I couldn't trace him any more. He must have gone over the cliffs. He couldn't have done anything else without me seeing him. I found his rifle, and here it is to prove what I say. I had to go back to climb down off the rim, and I rode quickly down the canyon. He's likely somewhere along that west wall, hiding in the brush, badly wounded if I know anything about the color of blood." "Well, that beats me holler, too," exclaimed Jordan. "Jim, what's to be done?" asked Springer eagerly. "If we're clever, we can catch that half-breed." "He's the last of the Vandeweghe gang," stated Jordan. "If you can show me his blood trail, I'll track him." "I'll show it to you," replied the other rustler. "But hold up. Shouldn't we check if he crossed the canyon first?" "I don't think he did, but we should make sure. And if he didn't, we'll find him along the West Canyon wall. He's not armed. He wouldn't have run that way if he was. Jim, he's easy pickings." "Sure, but he'll have that knife," pondered Jordan. "Don't worry about it," reassured the other. "He's wounded bad. We just need to find his trail and follow it carefully. He's hiding like a wounded wolf." "I want to be the one to finish him off," hissed Jordan. "I'd give anything to put a bullet in his throat." "Okay, let's go. Maybe it won't take more than 10 minutes. I can find him easily." "It would have been easy before, but I was scared," admitted the other. "Leave your horse with me and go ahead," ordered the rustler. "I have something to do in the cabin here." "Ha! Well, I'll go down the trail and wait. I'm not hunting Colin Vandeweghe alone. That knife he used on Greaves gave me a strange feeling. And maybe you should leave that Jorth woman alone for a while," suggested Jordan. "Springer, I might have to tie her up," muttered the other, his voice fading as the men walked away. Colin listened intently, straining to hear every word. Ellen stood by the door, her body tense with anticipation. Colin couldn't see her face, but he knew she was listening just as intently as he was. He couldn't resist looking at her bare shoulders, despite not wanting to. Ellen Yorth peeked out of the doorway, then quickly withdrew her head, turning to reveal her left arm marked with bruises from Jordan's grip. Suddenly she gasped, her eyes widening as she stared at her hand, which had a bright red smear of blood on it from a step on the ladder. Colin's heart leaped as he realized he had left his bloody tracks behind while climbing. It was the most terrifying moment of his life. Ellen's face turned pale, her eyes darkening and widening with shock and horror as she connected the blood on the ladder with Colin's escape. She stood there, still as a statue except for her heaving chest, before her fixed gaze transformed into a swift, dark blaze, looking up the ladder to the loft. Although she couldn't see him, she and Colin both knew she knew he was there. A remarkable change came over her features and even her body as Colin choked back his emotions. Slowly she hid the bloody hand behind her back while using the other to hold her torn blouse against her chest. Jordan's footsteps sounded outside, and it seemed like a breath of life had been blown into Ellen's being. Colin didn't know her name then, as he had never experienced the spirit of a woman before. She leaned back against the wall, her body softened and poised in an unexpected way. Jordan's tall shadow fell across the threshold, and Colin Vandeweghe found himself staring at the woman before him. In just a few seconds, she had transformed into someone he could not comprehend. "Jim, I heard all Springer told you," she said. Her words shook Jordan visibly as he stood with one foot over the threshold, eyeing her darkly. "Suppose you did. What then?" he demanded harshly. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "What of? Me?" he asked. "No, of Colin Vandeweghe. He might kill you, and then where would I be?" she replied. Jordan was taken aback. "What's got into you?" he exclaimed. He moved to enter, but found himself fascinated by her. "Jim, I hated you a moment ago," she burst out. "But now, with Colin Vandeweghe somewhere near, hiding, watching to kill you and maybe me too, I don't hate you anymore. Take me away." "Girl, have you lost your nerve?" he demanded. "My God, Jordan, can't you see?" she implored. "Won't you take me away?" "I sure will presently," he replied grimly. "But you'll wait till I've shot the lights out of this Vandeweghe." "No," she cried. "Take me away now, and I'll give in. I'll be what you want. You can do with me as you like." Jordan's frame leaped at the release of bursting blood. "Am I out of my head, or are you?" he asked in a low, hoarse voice. His face expressed extreme amazement. "Jim, I mean it," she whispered, edging an inch nearer him. Her face was uplifted, and her dark eyes were unreadable in their eloquence and mystery. "I've no friend but you. I'll be yours. I'm lost. What does it matter? If you want me, take me now before I kill myself. Ellen Jorth, there's something wrong about you, he responded. Did you tell the truth when you denied ever being a sweetheart of Sim Bruce? He asked. Yes, I told you the truth, she replied. Uh-huh. And how do you account for laying me out with every dirty name you could give tongue to? He questioned. Oh, it was temper. I wanted to be left alone, she explained. Temper. Well, I reckon you've got one, he retorted grimly, and I'm not sure you're not crazy or lying. An hour ago I couldn't touch you. You may now if you promise to take me away at once. This place has got on my nerves. I couldn't sleep here with that Vandaway hiding around. Could you? She asked. Well, I reckon I wouldn't sleep very deep, he replied. Then let us go, she urged. He shook his head in slow, doubtful vehemence, studying her distrustfully. Yet all the while there was manifest in his strung frame an almost irrepressible violence held in abeyance to his will. What about your being so good? He inquired mockingly. Never mind what's past, she responded with passion. I've made my offer. Sure there's a lie about you somewhere, he muttered. Man, could I do more? She demanded in scorn. No, but it's a lie, he returned. You'll get me to take you away and then fool me, run off God knows where. Women are all liars. Manifestly he could not believe in her strange transformation. Memory of her wild and passionate denunciation of him and his kind must have seared even his calloused soul. But the ruthless nature of him had not weakened nor softened in the least as to his intentions. This weather-vane veering of hers bewildered him, obsessed him with its possibilities. He had the look of a man who was divided between love of her and hate, whose love demanded a return, but whose hate required a proof of her abasement. Not proof of surrender, but proof of her shame. The ignominy of him thirsted for its like. Despite being able to crush Ellen Jorth's beauty, the man could not understand her feminine complexity. Beyond Jordan's limited intellect, beyond Colin Vandaway's love for her, Ellen possessed a power that held the balance of control. She had the ability to read Jordan's thoughts. Dropping her torn blouse, she stood tall and unashamed, her white breast pulsing as she stretched her arms out toward him. Her eyes were black as night, full of hell, her face white and tragic, yet strangely beautiful. "Take me away," she whispered, beckoning him closer. Jordan leaped with an inarticulate cry and a radiant face to meet her embrace, but as her left arm moved toward his neck, he saw the blood on her hand and wrist, which checked his ardor. "Blood, what the hell?" he exclaimed, grasping her tightly. "Did you cut yourself? Hold still." Ellen couldn't release her hand. "I scratched myself," she explained. "Where? All that blood." Suddenly Jordan flung her hand back with a fierce gesture, and the gleam in his yellow eyes was like the point of a leaping flame. He read the falsity in her secret. Slowly he stepped backward, cautiously moving his hand to his gun. His glance circled the cabin's interior, and he searched the ground before the door as if he had the nose of a hound and the sight to follow a scent. He quivered and grew as rigid as stone before moving his head with exceeding slowness, searching the dust for clues. He followed the trail of dust up the ladder and into the loft. Then he whipped out his gun and turned to face Ellen. "Ellen, you've got your half-breed here," he said with a wicked grin. She didn't move or say anything. She seemed to be collapsing, but instead her softness turned into a determined glow. This revealed her treachery. She knew what she was going to do all along. Jordan stood by the door and reached for the ladder, placing his hand on one of the rungs. He then showed her his hand, which had a dark splotch of blood. "See?" "Yes, I see," she replied with conviction. Passion overtook Jordan, changing him. "All that talk about leaving with me and giving in was a lie." "No, Jordan, it was the truth. I'll go now if you spare him," she whispered, making a small gesture towards the loft. "Girl," he exclaimed in disbelief, "you love this half-breed, this Vandaway. You love him." "With all my heart. Thank God it has been my glory. It might have been my salvation. But now I'll go to hell with you if you'll spare him." "Damn my soul," Jordan rasped out, as if he had some respect for her. You woman. Jorth will turn over in his grave. He'd rise out of his grave if this Vandaway got you." "Hurry, hurry," Ellen begged. "Springer may come back." "I think I heard a call." "Well, Ellen Jorth, I'll not spare Vandaways nor you," he replied with a dark and menacing leer as he turned to climb the ladder. Colin Vandaway had also reached the height of his anxiety. He tensed his muscles, ready to jump on Jordan as he climbed the ladder. But Ellen Jorth screamed loudly and grabbed her rifle, cocking it and holding it low. "Jordan!" Her scream echoed through the air as she called out his name. "You will spare Colin Vandaway," she demanded, her voice ringing out urgently. "Drop that gun, drop it!" "Easy now, Ellen," he replied, trying to calm her down. "Remember your temper. I'll let Vandaway off." His body shook as he crouched down, and he pleaded with her to drop the gun and not turn around. But she was resolute, and he failed to understand her determination. "Aw, now, Ellen," he begged, his voice growing louder and huskier. Slowly he began to turn, but before he could complete the motion, the rifle emptied its contents into his chest. He dropped the gun and reached out to her with both hands, an expression of surprise on his face. "So help me God," he whispered, his voice thick with blood. Darkness engulfed him as he groped for her, calling her a white-throated hussy. He grasped the rifle barrel, and she shot him again. He fell to the ground, writhing in agony. Ellen backed away from him, her arms outstretched. Outside, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. "Hey, Jim, what's the shooting?" called a voice from the doorway. Colin Vandaway gathered his strength for a final push, ready to escape. Springer, the newcomer, was shocked to see Ellen standing there, her eyes fixed on something on the ground. He followed her gaze and saw Jordan lying there, bleeding and dying. "You shot him!" he screamed at Ellen. "What for, you hussy? If you've killed him, I'll—" He strode towards Jordan's body, but Ellen stood in his way, her arms still outstretched. Without a sound, Colin rose to his feet and pounced on the rustler like a tiger. Springer looked up and let out a cry as Colin's moccasin-covered feet connected with his body, sending him crashing into the wall. As Springer struggled to regain his senses, Colin sprang up and charged towards him, knocking the gun out of his hand with one swift movement. Ellen stumbled out of the door, her body swaying before collapsing onto the grass outside. The sunlight shone down on her white skin, making her appear almost angelic. Colin was about to leave when he saw Ellen, and he quickly spun around to grab her blouse. However, Springer had already snatched it up. Colin grabbed a blanket and ran out to Ellen, calling her name repeatedly. When he reached her, he tried to wrap her in the blanket, but she clung to his knees, her face twisted with agony. She whispered something, and Colin nodded solemnly. "Yes, it's over. The Vandaway-Jorth feud is finally over," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. Ellen breathed a sigh of relief, her voice breaking. "Oh, thank God!" she cried. "Colin, you're hurt. There's blood on the step." Colin looked down at his arm and shrugged. "It's just a scratch. But, Ellen, we need to get you up. Please, let me help you." Ellen refused to move, her grip on Colin's knees growing tighter. She buried her face in his lap, and Colin felt her body shaking with sobs. He didn't know what to do, his heart breaking for her. "Ellen, you can't kneel there like that," he pleaded. "Please, let me help you." "I killed Jordan," Ellen gasped, her words barely audible. "I had to do it," she said firmly. "I offered to run away, but he wouldn't let me. He was going to kill you, and I couldn't let that happen." "For me!" he cried out, his voice full of pain. "Oh, Ellen, Ellen, it feels like the world is ending." "Quiet now," she said, trying to soothe him. "Don't say that. Of course I had to kill him. I saved your life. I wouldn't have let you go off with him." "Yes, you killed him," he said, his voice heavy with sadness. "We're both Jorths and Vandaways. We both have blood on our hands now, mine for you and yours for me." His words gave her strength, and she lifted her face to look at him. She was on her knees, and the tragic beauty of her posture made him feel something deep in his soul. "Blood on my hands," she whispered. "It was terrible, but all I care about is your forgiveness and your faith in me." "Child, there's nothing to forgive," he said gently. "Please, Ellen." "I lied to you," she cried out. "I lied to you." "Ellen, listen to me," he said, using a tender endearment. She leaned in close to him. "I know the truth now. I found out today what I always believed, and I swear to God I never believed what they tried to make me believe. Never." "Colin, I love you," she said, her voice full of passion. "I love you so much." "I can't lift you up," he said, his arms still crippled, "but I can kneel with you." And so they knelt together with the weight of what they had done heavy on their minds and hearts. The end. This concludes Sunset Mesa, a Western novel. Written by Ken Cannon. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.